Most people have never heard of Kharg Island. It sits in the northern Persian Gulf, about 25 kilometers off Iran's coast. It's small, roughly 8 kilometers long, 5 kilometers wide, and there are no hotels, no tourist sites. But what it does have is 55 oil storage tanks, a 2-kilometer loading jetty, and the infrastructure that handles somewhere of 90% of everything Iran exports in oil. For such a small place, it carries a lot of weight. The island is a raised coral limestone shelf. What made it useful for traders and sailors for thousands of years is the same thing that makes it useful today. The water around it, that is deep. Deep enough for the largest tankers on earth to dock. Most of Iran's southern coastline is too shallow for that, but Kharg is not. At its main offshore terminal, the water reaches 32 meters, and that is not something you can engineer around easily. That's either there or that isn't there. So the island has also natural fresh water, unusual for Gulf, which is why people settled here going back over 4,000 years. If you walk on the island today, you'll find the remains of megalithic tombs from around 1000 BC, rock-cut burial chambers, and one of the more surprising things in the entire region, a Nestorian Christian monastery, nearly 100 meters long with 19 monk cells, a library, and what appears to have been a scriptorium for copying manuscripts. It dates back to around 7th century. The French archaeologist Roman Grishman excavated it in the 1960s and noted that within this one small island you can find a Greek temple, a Zoroastrian fire temple, a Christian monastery, and an early mosque. Because Persians, Greeks, Arabs, Palmyrans, they all passed through it and they left something behind. Because of its position, Kharg was always a target for outside powers. The Portuguese came in 1507. The Dutch East India Company, they brought the island in 1753 for 2,000 rupees, and they built Mosselstein there. They ran it as a trading post, and they established the largest Catholic community in Persia at that time. In 1766, a local Arab named Mir Moana, he invited the Dutch commander to a meeting and used it as an opportunity to take control of the land. But the Dutch never came back. So the British occupied Kharg twice in 1838 and then 56 during the Anglo-Persian War, but both times they withdrew. So Iran has controlled it continuously since the 19th century. And one detail worth mentioning here is the Dutch pearl trade from Kharg's waters. It generated enough wealth that it helped fund the commissioners that produced several of Mozart's flute works. The oil era began seriously in 1956 when construction started on a pipeline connecting Kharg to Gashtaran oil field on the mainland, about 160 kilometers. So the terminal was inaugurated on November 8, 1960, and by the mid-1960s, it had become the largest oil export terminal in the world. The setup is fairly straightforward in concept. Even if its scale is enormous, it's simple. Oil arrives by pipeline, then it's stored in Play-Doh tanks, then flows by gravity down to the jetties. The T jetty on the eastern side has 10 berths and stretches almost 2 kilometers into the Gulf. So the offshore sea island terminal, it then handles the very largest tankers vessels. You can say up to 500,000 deadweight tons. At this capacity, 10 super tankers can be loaded at the same time. So Iran's oil revenues we have seen in recent years have ranged between $40 to $55 billion annually. And the overwhelming majority of that, it passes through the Kharg. The CIA described it in 1984 as the most vital facility in Iran's oil system, and that assessment hasn't really changed until now. The war began in September 1980 when Iraq invaded Iran. For the first few years of the fighting, it was concentrated on this island. It's grinding, costly, inclusiveness. By 1984, Saddam Hussein shifted the strategy. If Iraqi ground forces couldn't break Iran, perhaps Iraqi air power could do something. And the most direct way was to do that, to go after Kharg. So between August and November 1985, Iraq flew 44 raids against Kharg. The attack that August were among the most intensive of the war. Multiple aircraft came in with electronic countermeasures to suppress Iran's Hawk surface-to-air missiles, then followed up with bomb run against jetties and storage areas. Iraq declared the terminal destroyed, and Western analysts at that time, they believed them. But Iran didn't stop loading the ships. So the workers, they repaired infrastructure between the raids, and Iran moved its F-14 Tomcats, American-built, acquired before the revolution. They covered the island. So the Tomcat carried the long-range Phoenix missiles, and Iraqi pilots were cautious about engaging them. So on the water, Iran organized a shuttle tanker system using roughly 20 smaller vessels to carry crude south to secondary terminals at Kharg Island and later at Kharg Island near the Strait of Hormuz. When Iraq extended its range and hit those terminals too, Iran rebuilt and continued again. So over the full course of war, both sides attacked shipping in the Gulf. More than 300 vessels were struck in what became known as the Tanker War. The Seaways Giant, the largest ship ever built, 560,000 deadweight tons, was hit by Iraqi missile in May 1988 and sank. But Kharg kept operating throughout. So Iran exported oil through the entire 8-year war, not at full capacity production, and exports fluctuated considerably, but terminal never went completely offline. So Iraq never fully achieved what it set out to do. The ceasefire of 1988 was supposed to be the last time the world turned its eyes into the island looking for fire, but it wasn't. On the night of March 13, 2026, 25 days into a war nobody wanted to call a war, American jets struck more than 90 military targets on Kharg Island: the runway, the naval base, the air defenses, and the mine storage. Trump announced it on Truth Social before the smoke had cleared. The oil tanks, at least for now, were left standing. Iran said the island shook for nearly 2 hours. It also said all operations continued without interruptions. Both things may be true. The oil infrastructure remains the line Trump hasn't crossed, but he's named it publicly, tied it to Iran's closure of Strait of Hormuz, and said destroying the pipelines would take few minutes. As of today, Trump has paused threatened strikes on Iranian energy infrastructure for 5 days. He claimed talks with Tehran are underway, although Iran denies any negotiations are taking place. So the oil for now, it keeps flowing. Jalal Ali Ahmed called Kharg the orphan pearl of the Persian Gulf in 1960s, a place that existed for the world's fuel tanks, not for the people who lived in it. 66 years later, nothing has changed. So Kharg Island, where ancient monasteries, they share ground with 55 oil tanks, where a small community waits out a war they had no part in starting. We have seen every empire that ever wanted this part of the world. They eventually looked at Kharg. The Portuguese, the Dutch, British Empire, Iraq. I would say Iraq targeted this island 44 times in a single summer during 1980s, but it never stopped loading ships. The threats today are larger, the aircraft more precise, the stakes all about $100 a barrel, global markets, moving social media posts. It's somehow higher than that time. But America, with all precision and power, it's learning the same thing, the same lesson Iraq learned. Some things don't surrender just because you hit them. It will be very crucial to see what happens next.